Good afternoon. I am Attorney General Josh Stein of North Carolina. I want to thank you all for being here as we make this major announcement. And I'm pleased to be here with my colleagues, Attorney General Gordon MacDonald of New Hampshire and Attorney General Leslie Rutledge of Arkansas. I'm also pleased to be joined by Patrick Halley of U.S. Telecom, as well as representatives from a number of major telephone companies. 12 companies have joined us today, and they are AT&T, Bandwidth, CenturyLink, Charter, Comcast, Consolidated, Frontier, Sprint, T-Mobile, U.S. Cellular, Verizon, and Windstream. Today, we are announcing major bipartisan public-private effort to stop robocalls. But first, I'd like to introduce my colleague and fellow co-chair of this initiative, New Hampshire Attorney General Gordon MacDonald. Gordon.
Thank you, General Stein, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. The essence of our role as Attorneys General is to protect the public, and no single issue comes close to generating the volume of consumer complaints as robocalls. For virtually all of us, the spam calls are a ubiquitous and regular annoyance. But robocalls are also a very effective device for illegal conduct conducted by financial scammers who prey, particularly on the vulnerable, putting at risk their savings, their identity, their security. The Memorandum of Understanding we are announcing today will significantly enhance our efforts as Attorneys General to protect the public we serve. It is a very important moment. The robocall industry is inundating this country with these calls, 47 billion by one estimate in 2018. Robocalls are, as I said, a leading tool of financial scammers, and at great risk, in particular, are older Americans. And for a state like mine, where our population skews above the national average for those over 65, that's of a particular concern. Robocallers use techniques to trick those into answering their calls. And most important among those are neighbor spoofing, the neighbor spoofing technique. And by one estimate, over 40% of robocalls now have the neighbor spoof, which is when you use the 3 digits of the area code and the 3 digits of the local exchange to trick the person into answering the call. Once an individual answers a robocall, it confirms the number is a working line, thus increasing the chances that more calls will follow. And when an individual engages, they are at risk for divulging personal and financial information that the scammers want. And to take just one example from my state, an elderly woman suffering from dementia in the western part of my state on the Vermont border was subject to a robocall-initiated sweepskate scam, losing $90,000 of her savings. Beyond the scams and the spam, robocalls are having other damaging impacts. For one, they are changing the way we engage with our telephones. In fact, a preventative technique that we teach in our office is simply don't answer the phone. But there can be consequences for legitimate calls that are missed. Just last week, the statewide paper in my state, the Union Leader, reported this on its front page. When the phone call that Carrie Forbush had been waiting for came, she didn't answer it. The 29-year-old Manchester mother and teacher had been on the waiting list for a donor liver since last January and had been anxiously awaiting for the call that would change her life. But the number showed up on her phone last week seemed to be coming from Florida, and she thought it was a robocall, said her mother, Lori Kemp. It wasn't. It was Massachusetts General Hospital trying to alert her that there was a donor liver ready for her. Thankfully, the call went to voicemail, and she was able to receive that vital information. The unfortunate reality for our offices who are on the front line of dealing with this scourge is that our ability to protect the public through investigation and enforcement of our consumer protection and do not call laws has been limited. The volume of complaints generated by these billions of calls outstrips our available resources. Technology prevents tracing back the origin of the call, and the calls are often generated from outside our states and even outside the United States. And to date, our most effective tool has been prevention. And the Elder Protection Unit of my office has spent literally hundreds of hours educating and working with victims of financial scams generated by robocalls. Our duty to protect our citizens, however, requires more. And that's why I felt it was so important to join with Attorney General Stein in late 2017 to lead a coalition of more than 40 attorneys general to investigate the technological solutions available to voice service providers to stop unwanted robocalls. And the memorandum of understanding that we're announcing today is a direct result of those efforts. We were able to engage constructively and collaboratively with the industry and identify the 8 principles that Attorney General Stein will set forth in a few minutes. This is a significant step forward in our efforts to protect the people of our states. In my view, through our collective efforts, the MOU does 3 basic things. First, it will help stem the flow of robocalls by setting forth and encouraging those who are already implementing initiatives such as no-charge call blocking and call authentication. Second, our enforcement efforts will be greatly enhanced by providers' enhanced efforts to know their customers, to take up investigations of suspicious calls, and to take appropriate action if they deem that illegal calls or spoofing is taking place, and will provide an enhanced ability to cooperate with law enforcement in our investigation of illegal robocalls. Third, we will benefit from a cooperative and ongoing effort with the industry as we tackle the challenges we now face and take on any new technological developments as a result of this annoying and often illegal conduct. I want to thank Attorney General Stein and his staff, our industry partners, and the staff in my own Consumer Protection and Antitrust Bureau for all their efforts that lead us today to this very significant announcement. Now, Attorney General Rutledge.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all and to join my colleagues, General Stein and General McDonald. Every single Arkansan, every single American is absolutely sick and tired of illegal robocalls. Whether it's someone calling, claiming to be from the IRS, the Social Security Administration, perhaps someone claiming to be a grandchild in jail, or we've all received a call from Rachel from Card Services. This approach and this memorandum of understanding that we have worked collaboratively with our states, with the federal government, and most importantly, with the private industry to crack down on illegal robocalls. Because not only are they driving people up the wall, they're costing too many Arkansans, too many Americans, their life savings. Every single town I go to in Arkansas, I hear a story from someone who has sent money to an overseas con. Oftentimes I'm asked, as the Attorney General, Leslie, I signed up for the do not call list. Why am I still getting these calls? Unfortunately, the people that are making these calls are criminals, and they do not follow the law. And that is why today we are sending an even stronger message that we are going to work together to shut down these calls. In Arkansas, we passed a law this legislative session this spring. The law raises it from a misdemeanor to a felony if you spoof the caller ID. But most importantly, we worked with our carriers in the state. And now the carriers the providers are required to file with the Public Service Commission every single year what they are doing, what efforts they are making to shut down robocalls. So today's announcement, our work together, is a big step in the right direction because we want to save Americans' savings, we want to save their money, we want to save their identity, and that's what today is about. As we combat robocalls, it's going to take all of us working together. And again, I thank those in the private industry because the technological advances, quite frankly, the government can't do it alone. We must have our friends in the private industry to step up to the plate and to block these illegal robocalls. This has been a passion of mine after having my best friend's mother being taken advantage, after watching my mother-in-law receive these phone calls, and fortunately, she has not fallen prey, but too many people have. And as the Attorney General, I stand with my colleagues, I stand with the federal government, and we stand with private industry to shut down illegal robocalls. Thank you all so much for being here, and I'd like to welcome back A.G. Stine.
General Rutledge. Here, why don't you come on this? Thank you. Thank you, General Rutledge, for those remarks, and General McDonald. The stories that you all spoke really underscore the importance of what we are doing here today to put an end to these unwanted robocalls. They are affecting people in New Hampshire. They're affecting people in Arkansas. They're affecting people in North Carolina. They're affecting Americans all across this country. In North Carolina, it is the #1 source of complaints my office receives. We did a petition just a few days ago, a couple weeks ago, and within days we had more than 10,000 signatories expressing their outrage at these illegal phone calls. And to many of us, it's an annoyance, but to others, it's their life savings. A woman in Hickory, North Carolina, very similar to what you said, Gordon, she fell victim to a robocall about a sweepstakes and lost $220,000 as a result of these scams. We owe it to the most vulnerable in our communities to do everything in our power to protect them. That's why Attorney General MacDonald and I got together 18 months ago and said we want to tackle this, and we want to do it in such a way that we work with the telephone providers. We believed then, just as we believe now, that there is more that the phone companies can do to protect us and shield us from these unwanted phone calls. So we reached out to industry leaders and engaged in an extended dialogue to identify ways to better protect our constituents and their customers. And today, as a result of those extended negotiations, we announced the anti-robocall principles. These have been adopted by 12 providers today I identified. We encourage other providers to join as well. And every single attorney general in the country, all 50 states plus the District of Columbia. The 8 principles address illegal robocalls in 2 fundamental ways: prevention and enforcement. The phone companies will help prevent illegal robocalls by implementing call blocking technology at the network level at no cost to customers. Integrating the technology into their infrastructure will automatically scan out certain of these unwanted illegal calls. Additionally, the phone companies will offer customers free, easy-to-use technology for call blocking and call labeling when they want enhanced screening on their phones. They will implement technology that authenticates that the number that shows up on your telephone under caller ID actually represents the number that is making the phone call. And they will actively monitor their networks for robocall activity. Thanks to these prevention principles, our phones will ring less often. But unfortunately, there will always be bad actors. No matter how well we try to prevent these calls, some will get through, and that's why enforcement is such a critical part of what we are doing today. The phone companies will make sure that they know who their customers are so they can identify the lawbreakers. They will investigate and take action against robocallers using their networks, kicking them off, notifying law enforcement and state attorneys general. They will trace the origin of illegal robocalls so that we can know who they are and as they aid law enforcement. And they will require the other phone companies that originate calls but use their networks to also participate in our traceback efforts so that we can uncover and illuminate who it is that is violating the law. By shining a light on these robocallers, we will be able to aggressively enforce the law against the scofflaws and hold them accountable. As we all know, scammers are smart, creative, and greedy. They are not going to stop just because of what we're doing here today. And that's why our coalition will continue to work together. This partnership between industry and the attorneys general does not end today. This is not the ending. This is the beginning of a constructive, continued engagement. We will stay in close touch so we can respond as technology changes and, if necessary, augment these anti-robocall principles as necessary. Illegal robocalls harass and harm people all across this country. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet to putting a stop to them. If there were, it would have been taken care of a long time ago. But by adopting these technological solutions and improving their cooperation with law enforcement, these phone companies are going to better serve their customers. And I want to thank those companies that have already adopted these principles. I also want to thank the 50 other attorneys general who have been working together in a bipartisan fashion to stop these unwanted calls. I also want to thank the folks on my staff who, for the last year and a half, have been working their tails off to try to get this to a constructive resolution. Together, we can work together to protect Americans from these unwanted illegal calls. Now I would like to bring forward Industry Representative Patrick Halley, Senior Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for U.S. Telecom. Patrick.
Thank you, Attorney General Stein. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you, Attorney General McDonald, and Attorney General Rutledge, along with representatives from the nation's leading communications companies, to announce our shared commitment and partnership to protect consumers from illegal robocalls. U.S. Telecom's members, ranging from global communications providers to small broadband companies and cooperatives, understand that our customers are fed up with receiving illegal robocalls. The same is true for wireless and cable companies represented by CTIA and NCTA, who are also here today. We are all working tirelessly to end these harassing calls, and the principles announced today are a testament to the strong partnership between service providers and enforcement authorities at all levels of government to crack down on these fraudulent calls. The signatories of these principles are working daily to learn about the calls that traverse their networks, all in an effort to arm consumers with more information about the calls they receive and to empower them to block and to identify the source of illegal calls. We do this because our customers demand it, because it reduces the ability of criminals to achieve their fraudulent objectives, and because it increases the confidence of consumers and businesses that rely on our networks. Your example was exactly spot on. People just aren't answering calls anymore. That's not good for us. That's not good for consumers. And there's no single solution or entity that can solve this problem. That's why we are equally focused on strengthening coordination with law enforcement authorities, including state attorneys general and our federal partners at the FCC, the FTC, and other agencies. So what is industry doing? First, we're deploying call authentication technologies. They're commonly referred to as stir-shaken. It's a standard protocol that will substantially diminish the ability of illegal robocallers to spoof caller ID information. Second, more call labeling and blocking tools are available today than ever before to mitigate illegal or unwanted robocalls for consumers. And third, and this is important towards the enforcement aspect of what we're doing here, voice service providers are actively coordinating through U.S. Telecom's Industry Traceback Group to identify the source of illegal robocalls, working in close coordination with enforcement authorities to empower them to go after bad actors. Members of the Industry Traceback Group include traditional wireline phone companies, wholesale carriers, wireless providers, and cable companies. And U.S. Telecom has closely coordinated with the FCC, the FTC, and the state attorneys general based on the traceback results of this group, providing referrals that in some instances have led to enforcement action. And more recently, we've stepped up our coordination with the state attorneys general, a critical partnership. Working together, we can streamline enforcement efforts for these agencies. I should also say the traceback process, because of technological advancements and our own focus on it, what used to take weeks or even days, we can now do in hours to figure out who's actually generating these calls. As reflected in these principles, the carriers are taking steps to require their partners to participate in tracebacks, and they're actively monitoring their network to identify illegal robocall patterns, to make sure that customers are not making illegal calls, and to identify other providers that appear to be carrying illegal traffic. Neither the government nor industry alone can stem the flood of fraudulent, illegal robocalls. That's why U.S. Telecom and the companies here today are so committed to working collaboratively with our state and federal partners to thwart these illegal scammers. I want to thank the Attorney General who are here today, as well as their staff, particularly Attorney General your Stine staff, who worked with us very closely on this in a very collaborative process. We appreciated the opportunity to work with you, and I do agree that this is not done today. We will continue to work together. Thank you.
Patrick, thank you very much. Wonderful. That concludes the press conference, and we would be, any of us, happy to take any questions. Yes.
Thank you. Lynn Stanton from Telecom Reports. I was wondering what the plans are for working with smaller carriers that may not have IP networks in place. Now, this is for Patrick.
Yeah.
To get them involved in this, what can be done to get them involved in this?
Sure. So, look, we're working with all the carriers in this space, from the largest companies to the smallest companies, to provide information about, the different technological solutions that are available to identify and block illegal calls. There are some limitations in legacy networks, but there are active efforts right now looking to identify how we can ensure that call authentication technology, for example, can work on those networks. But more importantly, I think it goes to the point I was making, which is there is no single solution. So we're going to implement, call authentication technology. We're going to provide labeling and blocking solutions, and we're going to continue to trace back the source of these calls, because all three of those things together is really the answer, regardless of who the customer is.
Thank you.
Please turn on that mic.
Hi, Elaine Povich from State Line. As you know, there's legislation on Capitol Hill trying to address this, two bills right now, House and Senate. One of the things that some of the not carriers, but some of so-called legitimate businesses are worried about is being swept up in this robocall blocking software that would prevent legitimate businesses. Your doctor calls you to tell you it's time for your checkup. Your pharmacy calls to say it's time to renew your prescription. What, if anything, does this agreement do about these legitimate carriers and, businesses? And do you have any preferences in terms of the Senate bill, the House bill, or what Congress can do? As you say, this is a multi-pronged effort to help you in this regard, sir.
I'll take a first crack at that. We would absolutely welcome congressional action in this regard, just as we welcome the positive steps that the FCC has taken in recent months. But as states who are responsible for our constituents, we don't want to wait on Washington to do anything. So what we have done is develop these principles over many months in collaboration with the telephone providers who have to implement them. And the idea is some of these companies are doing these things. So some of the companies are doing some of these principles today. But for us to succeed in stopping robocalls, we need all carriers to do all of these things. And that's what these principles are all about.
Are you worried at all about legitimate companies getting caught up in the block?
I'll let Patrick take a swing at that. But I think that the sophistication of the call blocking technology is such that it can discern what is a lawful and what is an illegal robocall.
Happy to answer that. Certainly there are legitimate calls that are made via robocall technology, whether it's a call from your bank alerting you to fraud, or it's a school closing, or even a state or federal official having a telephone town hall with their constituent. By no means does anybody in industry want to prevent those calls from getting through. Unfortunately, as Attorney General Rutledge pointed out, these people committing illegal robocalls are criminals, and we are extremely focused on making sure that we identify and get rid of those calls off of our network so that the calls that do get made are legitimate calls that people actually want to receive. So we're sensitive to that issue. The call analytics technology that the carriers are deploying are very sophisticated. They get better every day to identify what is a call that should not go through and a call that should, and that's something we're very focused on.
Do you think the congressional bills will help or hurt in that regard, particularly the one that would sort of grandfather in legitimate businesses?
We've been supportive of the legislation, both the House and the Senate bill, and I think there's a recognition in the legislation and at the FCC, for that matter, that we all have to work together to make sure that we're really focused on those calls that shouldn't get through and making sure that the calls that should get through are completed.
Can you give us a sense of what does the latest evidence suggest about where most of these calls are originating? I mean, an awful lot are overseas. Do you have a sense of what percentage? Do you have a sense of which countries are at the heart of this?
What I can say is that a substantial amount of illegal robocalls are generated overseas. One of the important aspects of the work we're doing is to ensure that those gateway providers that allow those companies in are aware of these principles. It's not the companies that are signing on that are the ones that are generating all these calls. It's often platforms and calls that originate overseas. I will say it's not just overseas, though. Some of these calls, a lot, are generated in the United States, and that's where folks at the state level and the federal level can also go after those calls that are being made in the United States.
Do you think 50% overseas? Do you have any kind of a ballpark on that? Just so we have.
I don't have a number. Okay.
And what I would add to that is that, first of all, we already collaborate internationally. We're on a monthly call with Canada. Why the federal government is such an important part of this collective effort is they have the ability to work with their international counterparts when we've identified where the country is or what the perpetrator in that country. And what Patrick said is absolutely right. Even if the callers are located abroad, eventually there's a moment in which they are using an American company to have these calls pass through their network. If they don't originate on that network, they allow and profit from those calls. And when we can identify who those are, and if they persist in creating the possibility for these calls to come into this country, we will hold them accountable as well.
I just wanted to touch on the answer to the question or the concern that you had about legitimate calls not being passed through. And what this technology does is it recognizes where the call originates, but importantly, whether or not the folks making the call have the authority to use the phone number that's being displayed on the caller ID. I have not known my doctor, my bank, or anyone else to try to trick me into answering the phone. And so if they are able to identify that this phone number is not associated, that they do not have the authority to use it, because that's how so many Americans or Kansans see that it looks like one of their friends calling or down the street calling. Obviously, these people do not have the authority to use those phone numbers. And by eliminating those phone numbers and saying this person is using a number that they don't have the right to use, that will get blocked. Again, your doctor, your mother-in-law, you may want to block. I don't, but some people might. They're not going to use this sort of technology that these criminals are.
The mother-in-law is for the additional free, easy-to-use screening, not the automatic call blocking. Any other questions?
Hi, Ryan Tracy with the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Howell, you said you want to make sure that smaller carriers are aware of these principles. Is the expectation that you're going to try to add companies to this list to sign on? What do you expect in terms of getting companies, in addition to the ones that are on this list today, to agree to these principles?
Sure, and I think as Attorney General Stein mentioned earlier, we welcome all providers in this system, this ecosystem, to sign on and be aware of and sign on and adhere to these principles. I think we've got to be careful about saying small, right? It's not small. It's intermediary. It's where you are in the call path. So I think a lot of people assume, if I'm using my company, my voice provider, and I call somebody else, it just goes from them right to the end user's company. In reality, there's lots of different providers that are in the call path as that call gets delivered. And it's not so much small. Look, we represent, dozens and dozens of small providers that are serving the most rural parts of the country. They don't generate illegal robocalls, right? Their customers receive them. It's really the focus is on sort of these intermediate companies that are in the middle that you've never heard of, whose sole business is essentially to create a platform to originate millions of calls or to, deliver traffic from one carrier to another. So I think most importantly, in addition to the companies here, who I said, these aren't the companies that are generating these millions of robocalls. It's their customers. It's their networks that are being abused that receive these calls. It's who are those intermediate companies that either originate or allow blindly, millions of these calls to go over their networks without doing anything about it. And those are the ones I think that most importantly need to get this message.
Anything else? All right. Well, thank you all. I'm sorry.
You'd mentioned something about, I'm sorry, thank you, Lynn Stanton again from TR Daily. You'd mentioned something about holding carrier companies accountable if they allow these calls to come onto their network, and I'm wondering what kind of laws you have. I don't know it's different in each state, but in general, what kind of laws you might apply and how you would go after them.
Sure. A great aspect of what we're trying to do today is shine a bright light on this sordid industry that exists in the darkness. They are able to make all of these calls because it's very hard today to identify who they are and where they are. With all these commitments that the telephone companies are making, we will have much greater ability to know who it is who is breaking our laws. And when we notify the carriers whose networks it is that are carrying those calls and they refuse to take action, they will be violating our unfair and deceptive trade practices law. North Carolina has one. I'm sure that New Hampshire and Arkansas do, and most every state in the country does. And so we will aggressively use whatever authority we have to bring peace and quiet to people's homes, because these are an incredible annoyance, yes, but they are costing our people hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraud, and we cannot tolerate it.
I would just add, as attorneys general, we are on the front line. We are receiving these complaints from our consumers. That's why we can't wait for Washington to act. We need to get the information and the ability to identify the errant carriers so that we can exercise our existing authority to take appropriate action.
Brian Murphy with McClatchy. Is there any enforcement mechanism between the state attorney generals and the companies? And then is there any timeline on this agreement as go for perpetuity?
This is a collaboration, and it's one where from the beginning we realized that we as states can't solve this problem without the help of industry, and industry can't solve this problem without the help of law enforcement to go after the bad actors. And so we made an early decision. We wanted to come up with something that we could agree on. Now, not everything in here was embraced or enthusiastically received. It took extended and extensive negotiations to create these principles. But we have agreed on these. And so we will work collaboratively to make sure that whenever we can identify these bad actors, we will be able to go after them. In terms of whether the companies don't live up to it, we have ways other than going to court to encourage their ongoing cooperation. Anything else? All right. Thank you all for your interest.